Welcome back to Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie, where we believe in experience becomes truth. I'm your host, Tony Sweet, and joining me now in studio, world-renowned psychic Eddie Connor, with our co-host today, Walt Lusk. We want to thank you for supporting our sponsors by going to ConsciousLifeExpo.com to get your tickets for the February 2015 event.
And take your mind on a literary journey by traveling over to AdventuresUnlimitedPress.com, where you can purchase books from our famed experts featured right here on Truth Be Told. In our first hour, we spoke with best-selling author and Ancient Aliens alum Mike Barra about the possibility of life on Mars and his fascinating theory of known pyramids on the surface of the Red Planet. In this hour, we have author Nick Pope with us. Nick is an author, a journalist, and TV personality who ran the British government's UFO project and is now recognized as one of the world's leading experts on UFOs, conspiracy theories, and the unexplained.
I don't know about you, Walt and Eddie, but talking about top secret information, this is going to be a good show. I'm excited to get to the inside scoop from Mr. Pope and find out what's really going on.
Me too. All right, then let's just get the show started. Ladies and gentlemen, Tony Sweet fans from around the world, please put your hands together and welcome author and TV personality Nick Pope.
Nick, how you doing?
Fine, thank you.
Well, I'm Tony Sweet. I'm the host. I'm here with Eddie Connor.
Hi, Nick.
Hi, great to be on the show.
And then the Walt Lusk over here on Eddie's side.
Hey, Eddie. It's a pleasure.
So
I'm sorry. Long day. Hey, Nick, it's been a pleasure. Eddie, it's always a pleasure. Excuse me.
Okay.
I'm paying attention.
Well, Nick, it's an honor to have you on the show. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day and being a part of our show, Truth Be Told.
It'd be night because you're in England, aren't you?
No, I'm not. I'm actually over in the States now. I moved over. I emigrated nearly 4 years ago.
Oh, you're across the pond.
I'm actually in California.
Oh, nice.
Wow.
Well, welcome.
What part of California?
San Jose.
Oh, nice.
Fantastic.
Well, it's probably, I was going to say.
It's definitely sunnier.
Yeah.
Welcome to the wild, wild west.
So I'm ready to go on this journey with you because you had quite a ride in your life. You know, you look like a young man. You've spent 21 years in the British government at the Ministry of Defense, and I want to go back to when you were a little boy because I want to know, did you ever have any interest? Did you ever see any sightings, or did you have a passion or a hobby of studying UFOs at all?
Oh, yeah. What triggered it?
Yeah.
No, I had no prior interest in this at all. I mean, I guess I liked looking up at the night sky, and I knew the names of a few of the constellations, a little bit about the planets, but my interest was probably more astronomy than ufology. And I mean, really, I don't think I'd read a single UFO book in my life. I probably, like most kids, seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind when it came out, but that really was about it. So when I was given this job at the Ministry of Defense, and it was just one job out of a number that I had in my 21-year career, but I had no prior interest or belief in this. So in a sense, that was maybe the best way to go in because I had no kind of baggage, so to speak, in terms of going in as a believer, say. Or a skeptic, actually. I went in, hopefully, with an open mind.
Now, you didn't start your first job, or did you start your first job working with UFO projects? Or did you? What was your first job in the military?
Well, yeah, my first job, and by the way, I was a civilian employee of the Ministry of Defense, which is basically the UK's equivalent of your Department of Defense
Right,
in
okay.
the States. So I was never in the military, though I worked very closely alongside the military for most of my career. No, my first job was nothing to do with UFOs. It was, of all things, it was deconflicting the Royal Navy and the oil and gas industry in the seas around the United Kingdom. And so it was fairly kind of routine, but obviously quite important because we don't want warships colliding with oil rigs. Quite a routine job. So that really was my first posting, and I think I did that for maybe 2-3 years before I got promoted up to the next level. So yeah, I did about 7 or 8 different jobs in my 21-year career.
Now, what was your first job where they said, "Hey, we want you to research or follow up on a UFO sighting"?
Well, that happened in 1991, and my time on the Ministry of Defense's UFO project was 91 through to 94, and it all happened kind of by accident. I had been seconded off my usual duties and into a place called the Joint Operations Center during the first Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War. And I happened to be working fairly closely to a particular manager down there. And I was in the Air Force operations room, and we were basically a briefing cell. We would watch what happens and get all the raw data and translate it into something more manageable for politicians, the media, the public, etc. And I worked pretty well with this manager down there, and he said, "Hey, Nick, I understand that you're looking for a new posting after all this." And I said, that's right, yes. And he said, "Well, I have a vacancy coming up." And I said, "Oh, yes, what's the job?" And he smiled and said, "It's UFOs." And I kind of looked at him like he was joking. I said, "What? You serious?" And he said, yeah, that's the job. Do you want it? And I looked it up in the phone book. Now, the MOD back in those days had a huge 2-inch thick telephone directory, which was itself a classified document. Sure enough, I looked where this guy worked, and there was a little, a couple of names of my predecessor, and just a lot of people had really, really detailed job descriptions, and this one just said UFOs. So I said, okay, sounds interesting, I'll give it a go. And my life was never the same again.
To say the least.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so you got assigned to this position, and what was your first assignment? What was that first UFO sighting? What was it? How did you research it? Where did you go? What tactics did you use?
You never forget your first time.
Oh yeah.
Well, it's funny you should say that, and I'm hugely embarrassed to say that actually I do. And the reason for that is that, of course, most of these things turn out to be misidentifications of something quite ordinary, and aircraft lights, weather balloons, meteors. I mean, literally, on my first day in that job, I think I did nothing more than sit alongside my predecessor. We used to have these handover periods, and I just watched and listened him take calls, respond to letters from the public, media inquiries, whatever it is. And I shadowed him for a week. But as the week went past, and as I became more familiar with things, it effectively, and this is the whole point of it, he just said, "Oh, you take the next call." But I absolutely can't remember what it was. So that leads me to believe that my very first UFO investigation was probably not a very exciting one, and did turn out to be, it probably was just aircraft lights.
Right.
Then what was an experience, Nick, where on this particular job that the hair stood up on the back of your neck, and whenever you got deeper into the investigation, it absolutely blew your mind open?
Well, I think the case that really first hit me like a bolt from the blue was a case that I don't know whether listeners will be familiar with it or not. It's not as well known as it might be. It's generically known as the Cosford incident, and it's named after one of 2 Air Force bases in the UK that was involved in this. This was from March 1993, actually. Okay. So it was about halfway through my tour of duty, but it was the most striking case in my 3 years of official research and investigation. And it was a wave of sightings that took place over a period of about 6 hours, starting late on the 30th of March and continuing into the early hours of 31st. And there were lots of police and military witnesses because, as I say, 2 Air Force bases, Cosford and Shawbury, were directly overflown by a huge triangular-shaped UFO. And this thing, I remember speaking to one of the witnesses the morning after this, and his voice was shaking as he was telling me about this thing flying low over the base, maybe 200 feet above the ground. And this was a guy, 8 years experience in the Air Force. And he said this thing moved really slow, low-frequency humming sound, firing a narrow beam of light down at the fields just beyond the perimeter fence. And then, he said, it just shot away to the horizon many times faster than a military jet. And like I say, this guy had done 8 years in the Air Force, and his voice was shaking hours after this when I spoke to him about it. And we investigated for weeks. We caused, this is almost farcical, we nearly caused a diplomatic row between the United Kingdom and the United States because we sort of suspected this might be some secret prototype American spy plane or drone. And it led to denials, and then we went back and asked again, and the Secretary of the Air Force was incandescent with rage because he took this as an accusation that he'd misled Congress, and the whole thing got very messy. But suffice to say, we never explained this, and it's one of the most extraordinary cases on the files of the Ministry of Defense's UFO project.
Well, I'm so sorry for Tony's listeners. I'm not going to say the whole story because I've regurgitated it too much, but I've seen the triangular shaped ships before, and I've seen them traveling in a pod of 3 with one ship in front and then 2 right behind it, flying really super low, just barely above the treetops, and with the weird lights and the strange frequency that you're describing. I'm curious, how low were these particular ships traveling in this Cosford incident, Nick?
The estimate that I got from the Air Force witness said about 250 feet above the ground. Some other witnesses saw it at much higher level. I mean, there were really dozens and dozens of reports that night. One civilian witness, in fact a family of 4, said that they saw this thing so low that at one point, and they got into their car to chase it. This is how spectacular and unusual this thing was. Imagine a high-speed chase going on at night. This thing at rooftop height. Yep. A family of 4. The father putting his foot down, trying to chase this thing. The kids in the back screaming. And he said it was so low, at one point they pulled up by a farmer's field, and he said the thing must have landed. It was that close. It must have landed. And yet, when they got there was absolutely nothing.
Yep. I saw this thing happen to us, and there was a whole bunch of us kids in high school, and we were literally running through the fields underneath them, throwing rocks and potatoes up at it. That's how low it was going. And tons of witnesses. And the next day they were talking about it on all the local drive time in the morning radio shows, and then they just stopped cold turkey. And then they said, "Oh, weather balloons. It's weather balloons." And they never said another word about it. And so based on your history and everything you know now about classified and wanting to declassify some of this and get it out to the world, does anybody know where the heck the triangular shaped ships are coming from and what their deal is?
No. I mean, I think we sometimes like to kind of pretend that they must be new drones or something like that. But I mean, it's really just a fancy way of saying we don't know. And I mean, I look back at the history of aviation, and I mean, I think you can say with whether it's things like the U-2, the SR-71, or stealth fighter and stealth bomber, you can generally say that aviation technology runs, 10, 15 years maybe ahead of what's public knowledge. Yeah, sure, there are things flying around that you won't see at the big air shows for a decade or 2 even. But looking back at this in 1993, we have nothing now that can perform those sorts of speeds and maneuvers. I mean, and the other thing, you mentioned this, I think, this low-frequency humming sound.
Yes.
The Air Force witness said that it was one of those sounds that you could feel reverberating through your body as well as hear it. And he said the nearest comparison he had was like standing in front of a huge bass speaker at a rock concert. The thing passed through, waves passing through his body. He said he felt almost physically sick.
Yeah. And now, mine wasn't that strong, but it was the frequency, the vibration where all the hair on your body stood up and you almost felt like you could float underneath it.
Right.
So it wasn't nauseating feeling. It wasn't like the bass. It was just this sort of hum that lifted you up. It was weird. It's like a force field.
Right. Well, it sounds a fascinating encounter, and not a million miles away from the sorts of sightings that were coming in on that particular night in the United Kingdom. I mean, it really was, as I say, an extraordinary series of sightings, and it certainly changed my mind about all this.
I'm sorry, real quick, Walt. What was going on at that time? Do you feel that the enhanced sightings? Was there something going on at that time that you feel in your research that brought so much sightings that night?
No, there was nothing that leapt out at me. Nothing kind of, in geopolitical terms. I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I look back at, for example, Britain's best-known UFO case, the Rendlesham Forest incident, and that did take place at a very interesting time in terms of East-West relations. Margaret Thatcher had just been elected fairly recently. Ronald Reagan had won the election but had not yet been inaugurated. It was clear that the Cold War was going to take a dangerous new twist, and that's the background to the Rendlesham Forest incident.
Wow.
But I mean, at this particular time, no. I mean, I don't think there was anything going on that made me see a particular connection.
Well,
but it's an interesting question, and I think it's one that's often overlooked, against what geopolitical background does all this unfold.
Because we've interviewed people, that deal with Bigfoot and certain other subjects of, monsters to creatures that have seen. But we were talking to this one gentleman about Bigfoot, how there seems to be, when there's a Bigfoot sighting, there were also a lot of UFO sightings at the same time. And I don't know if that was something that's ever come up in a
causation or correlation.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I guess a few days before, I think South Africa officially abandoned its nuclear weapons program, and then, coincidentally or not, actually, a few days after the Cosford incident, there was a nuclear accident of some sort in
there we
Russia.
go. There we go.
And of course, I don't have to tell you, there is a huge body of evidence that suggests some sort of connection between UFOs and nuclear weapons.
Yes,
but I
yes.
didn't, there was no obvious link in with the UK on that, but who knows?
Are you familiar with the anti-gravity TR-3B?
Yes,
which has been around for about 20 years, developed by the U.S. government, supposedly.
Yeah, I've seen all the claims about this. As ever, I think it's difficult to differentiate the fact from the fiction, and in amongst all the genuine sighting reports and the fake ones and the photos, the videos, some are real, some aren't. It's really increasingly difficult these days to get to the bottom of what's going on, I think. But yeah, I'm certainly familiar with the story. I mean, I hasten to add that even though I worked for the Ministry of Defense for 21 years and had a top secret security clearance, I would not necessarily be read on to the indoctrination list for projects and programs like that.
Well, again, these are U.S. and yours from England, so might not mix and match.
That's an interesting point, because although the U.S. and the U.K. do, of course, have this special relationship, quote unquote, and are great allies, there was very little, if any, information sharing when it came to UFOs.
Right.
Well,
or indeed remote viewing, or any of these other topics that some people, wrongly I think, but regard as fringe.
Yes.
But this is not to pitch you against anything or anybody or any country, for goodness sakes. My question is, between what you know about Britain and the UK, and you working there, especially having kind of top secret clearance and stuff, and you living here and knowing what you know about our government, out of the two countries, which do you think is the most open-minded country about UFOs and that sort of thing?
Oh, goodness. I actually think it's a really tough call, because I think officially, the answer is it's about equal, in that officially pretty much everyone's closed to this, and it's denials all around. No, Project Blue Book closed down years ago. We're not interested anymore. Same story in the UK. Privately, yeah, there are some individuals who take this more seriously, but again, it's just a handful of people. And look what happens in terms of the ridicule when someone does speak out. I mean, I think back, for example, to Denis Kucinich and his presidential campaign, and how that was torpedoed really by the revelation that he'd seen a UFO while staying with Shirley MacLaine.
Meanwhile, do you think there are powers that be behind the powers that be that run the powers that be?
Very probably. I mean, I think what is clear to me is that over the last couple of decades, probably going back longer than that, but there's been an interesting transitioning of power away from government. Now, this might seem to many people counterintuitive, but I think you know what I mean when I go on to say that, for example, putting certain projects and programs out of government and into the private sector does two things. Firstly, it makes congressional oversight and scrutiny more difficult. And secondly, it takes it outside of the scope of the Freedom of Information Act. Now, that's something I noticed, and it actually happened to a limited extent with some UFO work in the United Kingdom. I would not be surprised if the same was here in the U.S. too.
It is.
It is happening. Oh, yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
And it's happening.
And I mean,
right under our noses.
Sorry, I was going to say, just to complete that thought, I mean, the other point which is related to all this is if you look at the executive boards of all these big defense and aerospace corporations, you'll generally find a whole lot of retired generals
overlap
stepped out of. So that's what's going on, I think.
I think so too. And it is so obvious that it's happening, but the mainstream people are not getting it just yet. But I'm afraid that they might get it when it's too late. And if you're just tuning in, you're listening to On Air with Tony Sweet's Truth Be Told. I'm Eddie Connor.
I'm Tony Sweet.
I'm Walt Lusk.
And we are speaking with Nick Pope. Nick is an author, journalist, and TV personality who ran the British government's UFO project and is now recognized as one of the world's leading experts on UFOs, conspiracy theories, and the unexplained. And Nick, I want to ask you, I know that you've written 4 books, all of which have been published by Simon & Schuster. Now, you have some nonfiction books. One is Open Skies, Closed Minds, which is about UFOs, but I want to specifically ask you about your book, The Uninvited, which is about alien abduction mysteries. And again, it's nonfiction, ladies and gentlemen, so I'm dying to know about this.
Well, this was basically, Sorry, go on.
Oh, no, we're just dying to know about you, how you feel about abductions and about your book.
We want you to go on.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Well, I had written Open Skies, Closed Minds, and that was meant to be an overview of the UFO mystery, but with particular reference, obviously, to my official Ministry of Defense research and investigation. So I thought, well, I wonder. People were asking me if I was intending to write some sort of sequel or follow-up, and I hadn't initially intended to, but then I thought, well, wait a minute. I mentioned a few of these abduction cases in my first book, but really it was, I guess, in the 90s that the whole alien abduction mystery exploded into the public consciousness in a way that it had not before. I mean, I think arguably it started in very late 80s with Bud Hopkins and Whitley Strieber and Dave Jacobs and people like that. But when mainstream scientists, mainstream academia personalities like John Mack got involved, I mean, this suddenly became big news. And I thought, okay, I'll write a book about alien abductions, whether it's going back to the 50s and the so-called contactees or the more modern claims that people were literally being taken onto spaceships and things. So I wrote really a kind of almost a social history of the whole mystery, starting with folklore even, going back to folkloric accounts of people interacting with dwarves and fairies and drawing parallels between things there and the whole concept of missing time that you find in alien abduction.
Right. Yes.
So I wrote that, and then what I did is really to put some flesh on the bones, I took 5 or 6 British cases that people probably weren't as familiar with as they were with cases that they probably read about from Bud Hopkins, John Mack, Dave Jacobs. And I really devoted a chapter each to I think 5 or 6 cases from the UK. The names of the people were not known, and really that way I said, well, this is the raw data. Just make of this what you will. And yeah, I'm pretty pleased with that book, but it's probably about 15 years old now. Now I have a confession to make. I think I sent, or maybe even haven't updated my website. I've actually written one further book.
Yay.
So it's 5 now, which is much more recent.
Okay.
And in fact, it just came out a few months ago, and it's called Encounter in Rendlesham Forest. And that one is self-evidently about the UK's best-known UFO incident. So I do have a more recent book.
Yeah, I'm showing it right now, and that's actually a fascinating story. And for the people out there that's listening in or watching us right now, can you explain a little bit more about that incident?
Sure. This was December 1980, and 2 American bases on British soil, Bentwaters and Woodbridge. Guards see strange lights in the forest. They think that an aircraft has crashed. They go out to investigate, and they find a landed UFO in a small clearing. There are symbols on the side, a bit like Egyptian hieroglyphs. One of them, Jim Penniston, gets close enough to touch the side of this thing. Suddenly there's a flash of light. The craft slowly takes off, vertically maneuvers its way through the trees, and then shoots off at high speed. 2 nights later, the UFO returns, and the witnesses, incredibly, include the deputy base commander himself, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, who went out into the forest when he was told that the UFO had returned. In his own words, he said, "I'm going out to debunk this nonsense for once and for all." And he ended up
his famous
UFOs.
last words.
Yeah. And he saw this thing. He saw it fire a beam of light down at the ground just feet in front of him and his men. And he, looking back on this, he said, he speculated, was this a weapon? Was this communication? Was this a warning? What was this? Well, anyway, I took this case because really I thought, this is second only to Roswell, I guess, in terms of significance, in terms of its extent to which it's public knowledge. Right. So I thought I wanted to do, and in fact, this one was published not with Simon & Schuster, but with St. Martin's Press, which is part of the giant Macmillan group. But again, I teamed up, in fact, with the 2 witnesses from the first night, John Burroughs and Jim Penniston, both of whom obviously ex-United States Air Force, served for many, many years with high distinction. And the 3 of us got together and wrote this book, and we based it on official witness testimony, documents that we obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. So it really is a kind of inside story of this. I think a lot of times with UFO books, you read kind of people's outsiders looking in, but this, given that I'm ex-Ministry of Defense and John Burroughs and Jim Penniston are ex-United States Air Force, this was kind of insiders looking out. So we flipped the usual dynamic.
And with flipping the dynamic, what kind of feedback are you getting when you take the reader right inside of the story like that with the inside scoop?
Well, I think we did one of 2 things. I mean, the feedback that we've gotten is almost universally positive, and people have said things like, "My goodness, I feel I was almost out there in the forest with those guys." And of course, we went into such detail, given our backgrounds and our knowledge, such detail about the kind of military standard operating procedures, the kind of way that things work in government, that again, readers felt, and this is the feedback that we've got, that they were almost sitting in Department of Defense headquarters, getting a brief on this from the generals and things. And we were very pleased with the way it turned out. And of course, as a result of that, we got a lot of people, ex-military government some of whom were witnesses to this, but never came forward, contacted us to say, hey, I think I've got a piece of the puzzle. And that kind of process is ongoing. We're still evaluating a lot of new data that we're getting in. But I think, I'm very pleased to have gotten that book out. As I say, it's Encounter in Rendlesham Forest. And I think, with Roswell coming up to being 70 years in the past now, I'm skeptical that we're going to crack that one open with pretty much all of the primary witnesses dead. But Rendlesham Forest, we do stand a chance of cracking the mystery.
Now, when you were actually in the post, in your position, could you have shared the information you're sharing now?
No. For two reasons. Firstly, obviously the Ministry of Defense was, and still is, an inherently secretive organization, and I was bound by the Official Secrets Act, and I still am, by the way, even though I left the ministry in 2006. The Official Secrets Act, my security oath, binds me for life. So that was one problem. But the other thing was that the United Kingdom at the time did not have a Freedom of Information Act. Now, we got that a few years back, and it's only because, the only reason that I'm able to speak to you about this is because a few years ago, the Ministry of Defense decided that it was time, or maybe it was decided for them.
Thank you.
Declassify.
Right.
Well, time to declassify and release the entire archive of UFO files. And something very funny happened, which I think almost none of the mainstream media picked up on, which is kind of interesting. For years, the Ministry of Defense had told the British Parliament, the media, and the public that this subject was of very limited interest and of no real defense significance. And then two things happened. First, under the Freedom of Information Act, when we got it, the Ministry of Defense found that more journalists and members of the public were asking about UFOs than any other subject.
Good.
So that was the first shocker. But the real kind of icing on the cake was when they started releasing these files, this subject, which they claimed there was no real interest in, very limited. We just glance at these reports. There's no defense significance here. When they counted up how many documents that they had on UFOs, there were over 55,000 of them. And some of them had been classified secret UK eyes only, which is only one down from top secret. So not bad for a subject that for years they'd been telling people was of very limited interest.
Now, so
you've been... That process, by the way, still isn't complete. They started it. The first batch of files was released in May 2008, and the final ones won't be out until September 2015. So just gives you an idea of the scope of this project.
Now, you've heard of, Men in Black here. Of course, the movie kind of really brought it to the surface. But have you had any sort of encounters with people of sorts?
Encounters or awareness?
Or awareness of people coming to you and saying, we don't want you speaking out. We don't want you telling the stories. Have you had that yet? Or...
No, I haven't. And I have to say, and I don't mean this to belittle those people that have had those experiences, but I've, of course, because of my government background, kind of been accused of being a man in black myself.
Oh, wow.
So,
I can see that.
But no one has ever said to me, stay away, you're getting too close to the truth or anything like that. Having said that, I must confess, of course, that as a former government employee still bound by my secrecy oath, I did have to pre-submit the manuscript for Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, actually both to the Ministry of Defense and to the DOD here in America. So it's probably the only UFO book in history ever to have needed security clearance from the British and American government.
Wow, that's impressive.
All right, let me ask you this.
Together all the time.
But let me ask you this. How many rewrites did you have to do?
Well, put it this way. I think not a lot, but mostly I kind of self-censored because, again, in a bizarre twist of fate, I had actually, in one of my previous Ministry of Defense jobs, been responsible for vetting other people's books. Actually, just after the Gulf War, a lot of the books that people had written about what went on there crossed my desk, and I'm afraid to say, guilty secret, I was the censor with the black pen.
Oh.
So I've sat on both sides of the desk, so to speak. So I kind of knew what could go in and what could never go in.
Now, okay, you have a lot of knowledge, 21 years of knowledge of all
front row seat.
Out of 100%, how many percent can you actually tell us, and what percentage can you not tell us?
You mean out of 100%
of the knowledge that you know? Is there any percentage of that you still have not?
80%.
Yeah, I mean,
if I tell you, I have to kill you.
Yeah, it's a really good question, but it's such a difficult one to ask. And the other thing, I mean, do you mean just on UFOs, or do you mean on all
just
the
on UFOs? UFOs,
okay,
yes.
UFOs.
Well, I'm going to talk about crop circles.
Okay. I think most of what I saw I could tell you about, and indeed most of what has, most of these 55,000 pages of documents have been released. But I think there's two things. Firstly, the signal-to-noise ratio in this subject is extraordinary, and that applies just as much within government as outside it.
Yeah.
So when you look at even the secret Ministry of Defense files on this, it is 90% aircraft lights and weather balloons and investigations by the government, sure, but into things that turned out to be pretty mundane. So in percentage terms, the interesting stuff is actually very small. The other thing is sometimes I think governments are very good at hiding things in plain sight.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
So sometimes something can be released and it's out there, but for some reason it's the classic case of the best place to hide a book is in a library. It's almost like people see and yet they don't see.
Well, that's like many bills that go through our Congress. They put those little things in the bottom of the pile, then they pass it, and the people are like, when did they pass that? So
when you were asleep
when
at
you're
3 a.m. in the morning.
On a Saturday.
Yeah. Let me give you one example, just one example that perhaps illustrates this. In 2006, the Ministry of Defense declassified an intelligence study into UFOs, which had been codenamed Project Condign. I mean, you can find the thing out there, in the web even. It's on the government website. But it goes on to talk about how a better understanding of, as we called them, UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, could lead to what we called novel military applications. And it went on to talk about weaponization, particularly the development of a directed edge weapon, RF weapons, and various other points. And this was released, and none of the media, absolutely zero, picked up on this document. And the reason they didn't pick it up was the document was 468 pages long, and this was tucked away somewhere in Annex C to Working Paper B, somewhere a few hundred pages in. But very cleverly, what the government does is sticks an executive summary at the front, and then they rush these things out. All the media stampede to try and be the first to get the story out, so they read exactly the bit that they want you to read, the executive summary.
That so fascinating.
There it is.
Typical.
Now, you started this whole thing way back, unknowing, unaware, and maybe even a skeptic. And after 21 years involvement, do you personally feel or believe that there are UFOs, there are, extraterrestrials, and that we are being visited or have been visited by such?
I'm still not 100%. I mean, I've not seen a smoking gun. I've not seen a spaceship in a hangar, whatever you want to call it. Life out there, elsewhere in the cosmos, absolutely. Any of it coming down here visiting us, I don't know. I'll use the phrase that I sometimes used internally in the ministry. We certainly could not rule out that possibility. And like I say, some of these cases, I once went to an intelligence briefing on all this, and the briefer was pointing to a photo on the wall, a very good UFO photo that we'd acquired, and he was waving his finger around at a map, and he said, "Well, it's not the He said it doesn't belong to the Americans." He pointed his finger one way. He said it doesn't belong to the Russians. He pointed his finger the other way, and he said that only leaves. And his finger was pointing directly up at the ceiling.
Love it.
On your website, you even address a lot of different things, but also crop circles, which has been a little interest in mine. What's your take on crop circles?
I'm afraid I started off being quite interested and impressed, but I became actually rather more skeptical on that when I saw how sophisticated some of the very human circle makers were. People going out in large teams. It's not just two old guys with a rope and a
rake.
And a board.
But mathematics and engineering students going out in large groups with night vision goggles and GPS, handheld GPS systems, and having these things planned out well in advance on computers. I mean, there's a degree of sophistication here, and I'm afraid I have yet to see a crop circle that I don't think people could have made. Sorry, I've probably upset a whole load of people,
Right.
maybe
okay.
yourselves, but
That's all right.
I'm just calling it how I see it.
But I mean, that's the thing is you're living, what a lot of people just see in books and on magazine. You're actually going out to the places, the locations to where this stuff is happening. So, and like you said, 90% are probably not.
Or Chinese lanterns that they claim is extraterrestrial.
Right. So, you can't think that everything is a UFO. That's just not going to, that's just not probable.
You can't. And you always, even if you are the biggest skeptic in the world, every day at the Ministry of Defense, we reminded ourselves of one thing. The believers only have to be right once.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So now that you're not with the Ministry of Defense, MOD, do you still go and do your research? Do you still follow up on sightings, or?
No, I tend, I don't have the resources to do. I mean, of course, when I was at the Ministry of Defense, we could pick up the phone, we could get the instant access to the radar data, we could get meteorological reports, we could get astronomers in telling us about any particular phenomena that might explain sightings on the night. If we got a photo or a video, we could get the most sophisticated Air Force intelligence imagery analysis capability brought to bear on this. Now I'm out of the game. I don't have access to any of this, so I think in a sense it would be silly for me to try and pretend that I could investigate with that level of sophistication. So of course I still get people send me stuff all the time, but I just don't have the resources or indeed the time now. So I generally refer them off to groups like MUFON.
Right.
And I still obviously comment on this subject in the media. I believe my role in this subject is now maybe more to use television and radio to try and get the information across and do that. But I don't pretend that I can continue my investigations the way I used to.
Well, Nick, back in the day, what was the one video or picture that you saw? We know you didn't see an actual ship, as it were, but what video or piece of evidence did you see in video or photograph that really just made your jaw drop open, if any?
Yeah, we had some photos taken that were sent to us. They'd been taken in August 1990 in Scotland, and they showed in broad daylight a huge diamond-shaped craft which looked as if it was either being chased or escorted by two military jets.
Wow.
And this thing was kind of battleship gray in color, and there was no obvious fuselage, wings, ailerons, flaps, no obvious propulsion system. And this thing, these images have been looked at by the UK's, by the Defence Intelligence Staff and by the Joint Aerial Reconnaissance and Intelligence Centre. So really the UK's top imagery analysts have looked at these photos, have said they are genuine, they show a solid, structured craft, apparently just, like nothing that we've ever seen before, just hanging there in the sky. And I thought, probably naively, well, that'll be interesting, given that the Ministry of Defense is declassifying and releasing its UFO files. It'll be interesting when those images came out, and when they were due to come out, they had mysteriously gone missing.
Yep.
Well, before we get out of here,
Yeah,
I know you
I hate it when that happens.
I know you've worked with some movie production companies, and what was it like, working with the X-Files and I Want to Believe and the remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still? What was your role in these movies?
Oh, well, I think because of the fact that I did as a government job what a lot of these sci-fi movies are around, what they're about, very often film production companies come to me and they say, hey, how can we make this close to life? Could I help promote the movie and say how close it is or not to the reality? And I worked on some really interesting ones. I worked on Super 8, on Battle Los Angeles.
Right.
Like you say, the remake of Day the Earth Stood Still, the second X-Files movie. I think the second X-Files movie was my favorite because the media in the UK did call me the real-life Fox Mulder.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Somewhere, so it was, what was quite fun was actually getting to meet David Duchovny, and we actually, I finally met up with him and Chris Carter just before the UK premiere of the movie. And it was fun, and there's a picture somewhere, I think it's on my website somewhere, nickpope.net. There's a picture of me standing next to a very tired and jet-lagged David Duchovny who's just come in from the US. And so that was a fun kind of fact meets fiction. But it's great. I love working on these sci-fi movies. I've actually written 2 sci-fi novels myself. So again, I've kind of played both sides of this. And I very much enjoy that side of my work. And I think sci-fi is great fun. It doesn't take away from the reality of some of this that we've been discussing, but sci-fi is great fun.
Well, it's great to see that you're enjoying this and you're having a great time, because that's what it's all about. That's when you're not working, and we really enjoy having you here, and we'd love to invite you back.
Yes.
If you're in the LA area, please stop into the studio. We'd love to have you in and talk some
absolutely.
more. And you can pick up all of Nick's books on Amazon, and I'm sure, are they in like Barnes and Noble or anything like that?
Yeah, certainly the latest one, Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, is. But information on my books and indeed all my government work, probably the best first port of call is just nickpope.net.
Perfect.
Okay. And then you can also follow Nick on Twitter at nickpopemod. And you can check him out, follow him, and see where he's going to be next. Are you going to be doing any lectures or any appearances? Any appearances soon?
Yeah, what have I got coming up? I'm doing a UFO conference in January, I think, in Del Rio. And then I'm going, which I'm sure you know about, to the Conscious Life Expo.
Yes.
February
yes.
20th.
We'll have a booth there, and we're broadcasting live, so we have to stop by.
Oh, great. Well, I'm going to be at the Conscious Life Expo, too. I'm one of the speakers. So I will definitely come up to you guys and come up to your booth, and let's put some faces to some names.
Yeah, and definitely you're going to have to sit in. We'll have to do some segments because we're going to be live. But thank you so much, Nick. We so appreciate you. And you're great. It was fun. I really enjoyed it. So come back soon, and if not, we'll see you in February at Conscious Life Expo.
Have a great holiday.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Take care, Nick. All right. Well, it is time that we get out of here. Well, we're not getting out of here. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back because Eddie Connor is going to do what?
Unlock the universe within.
Unlock the universe within. All right, don't go anywhere. On air with Tony Sweet. Truth be told, right
Don't
here
touch that
on
dial.
Universal Broadcasting Network. Be right back.